All right, so we're going to walk through examples of all three of those different ways you can use calculations through Studio, starting with the first one, which is calculated fields. And I've got a pretty long list of examples I'm going to run through with you here, going fairly well from simple to more complicated. And so this is going to give you a pretty good variety of ideas of how you might be able to use some calculated fields. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up Sugar. And I'm already in Studio. So you can see, whoops, too many screens. You can see, Studio with all my different modules in here. I'm going to start off with a few examples in the Opportunities module. So we'll go into Opportunities and go into our fields. And the first example I'm going to do is sort of a silly one that actually doesn't make any sense, but it's the simplest thing I could think of. So I wanted to start with something super easy. Like anything else, when you're doing your calculated fields, you want to make sure you think about your field type first, so what type of result you're going to have. And the first one I'm going to do is a really simple sum that, like I said, makes no sense. I'm just going to have Sugar add up the likely field and the best case field. Just again, I want something super easy as a starting point. So in order to turn our field into a calculated field, we're going to check the box here to turn it on, and then we're going to open the formula builder with the edit formula button. You can see now that I have it open, like Justin said, as you hover over a function, it's going to give you some tips about how to use that function, which can be really helpful. It will also tell you over here to the right with this little symbol what type of result it has. You can see all these numbers are things that have numeric results. These are things that have true, false results. There's some date results and so on. So you have a variety of different types of functions you can use. One other important thing to know when you're working with the formula builder is you are going to be using the back-end field names. So sometimes the field names versus the labels of what you call them are not the same. You might have changed what a field is called. So before you actually start building a formula, it's really important to do some pre-work of making sure you know what everything is called. In this case, if I want to add the likely field and the best case field, I need to know that the likely field is actually called the amount field. The best field is actually called the best case field, because those are how I'm going to see them in the formula builder, not the labels that may have been changed. And the same would be true for any drop-down items that you're going to be using. You'll need to know the drop-down item names, not the labels. So like I said, we're going to start with something super easy. We just want to add two things together. I can look through my list of functions here, or I can search if I know what it's called. And it looks like that function is called the add function. We can see in the example here that we can put as many different numbers into that function as we want. So if we want to add 3 things, we would just, add all 3 things. In this case, we're going to just add 2. I can click on this and it will add it into my formula here, or I can just type it if I know what the function is called. And then same thing with the fields. If I know what the field is called, I could start typing it, or I can find it over here and click on it and it will go ahead and add it. So that you can see a little bit of both, I'll go ahead and start typing best case. It does do searching and kind of type ahead so I can find what I'm looking for that way as well. The field names are always going to have the dollar symbol in front of them. That's Sugar's syntax for marking that as a variable, as a field name. And as Justin said, the syntax here, pretty similar to a lot of the Excel functions. You're going to have your function and then your arguments inside in a parentheses. And again, you can see the examples here of how to use them. So like I said, that one's super easy. We're just going to add those 2 numbers together. We'll go ahead and save that field. The next one we're going to do is going to be something a little bit perhaps more practical, as well as a little tiny bit more complicated, which is a weighted opportunity amount. So I want to take my opportunity probability and multiply it times my opportunity amount to get a weighted value for that. My opportunity probability is stored as an integer. So also I just realized I clearly didn't walk through this one example first, because that's actually at the revenue line items level in this particular demo environment. So we're going to jump really quick there. I want to take my probability, which is an integer, and I want to divide that by 100 to turn it into a decimal, and then multiply it times my amount. So this is going to have me working with a couple of different fields and a couple of different functions. And before I get too far, I better make sure this is actually a currency field. Can you guys hear me okay? I just started getting some weird feedback through my headset.
No problem on my end. If anybody listening is having any issues with that, just chat it over to us and let us know.
Sorry, not sure if you are hearing me or not because that sounded terrible to me when Deneen talks. So I'm going to try changing my settings really quick. Okay, Deneen, can you say something again?
Hello.
Yes, that's much better. Okay, that's what I had. Thank you.
Okay.
Something I ran into once before, so I had a feeling that might be what was happening, but some issue with my headset. All right, so what I was going to do before I got interrupted by terrible noises in my head was a weighted opportunity amount. So we need to take the amount of we take our probability and divide it by 100. So we're going to look for a function for dividing. Here we go. And we want to take our probability and divide it by 100. I can just type in my number, my 100. And then I want to take that and I want to drop it into my multiply function. So I'm actually going to put my multiply function first because I want to take the result of this and use it as one of the things that I want to multiply together. So I'll go ahead and just type it in here. If I click it, it's going to add it at the end. Oops, I clicked the wrong one anyways. But if I click it, it added at the end. So I can either copy and paste it to the front or just type it in the front. All right, so I'm going to take my answer from dividing my probability by 100, and then I want to multiply that times my amount, which is actually called amount here. It is called likely case. See why knowing those field names becomes really important. So again, what we're doing here is embedding one function inside of another. We're getting the answer from this function, dividing our probability by 100, and then using that to multiply it with the likely case. So you can see how we've got to sort of stack our functions inside of each other here to get to the result that we want. All right, well, that's saving. Let's go check and see what our next example is going to be. So the next thing I wanted to show you was how you can convert data types from one to another, mostly because we're going to use this a little bit later on within another example. So let's say we have data that we want to use somewhere else, but it's a different type of information. In this case, we're going to do a drop down versus a text field. So we've got a drop down field. For whatever reason, we want to store that result in a text field or use it somewhere as text. We do have to convert it first to a string, which is a text value, in order to use that as a text value. And there's one sort of extra step we're going to do here because we're working with a drop down. So let me go check really quick. Our sales stage field is using the sales stage DOM drop down. Okay. So we're going to copy the stage into a new field. It's going to be a calculation. And in a lot of cases, if I want to convert something, there's a function for that. So if I type in 2 here, you can see there's a toString function that will take a value and turn it into a string, into a text. So in the example they're using here, they're taking a number and they're converting it into a string to use it as text. You can do the same thing with a date value. If you wanted to use the date into a text field, you could use the toString function for that. The added complexity for dropdowns is, again, going back to the fact that dropdowns have a name and a value, a label. So they have their actual value, their actual item name, and then they have the label that users see on the front end. If we do toString with our dropdown value, dropdown field, it's not going to cause an error. The formula is going to work. It's going to correctly convert this value to the string, but the value it's converting is that backend database value, not the front end string or the front end label that users are used to seeing. So in some cases, we really want that label. We want that value instead. There is a function for that called getDropdownValue. And so this lets us pass in the name of the dropdown that we want to use, and then the actual backend value, in this case, our field value, and get the label instead of the backend value. And so we can put that in here. The name of our dropdown we just looked up was sales stage dom. And then we want to pass in the field. So what we're saying here is take this field value, get its label using this dropdown list, and then convert that to a string. And actually, now that I look at this, I probably wouldn't actually need to convert this to a string because this one is in fact returning a string value. So the toString function here is not necessary because it's already returning a string. I do want to point out before I forget that when I'm typing in a text value where my argument is or my function is expecting text, I do need to put quotes around that value. So Sugar knows to treat this as a text value. All right, and we're going to use that concept in our next example, and we'll use revenue line items again since we're already working there, but we're going to concatenate, which means put multiple text values together, several fields, in order to give a standard name to our opportunity, or in this case, our revenue line item. So rather than having the users type in a name for their revenue line item, we're going to have it pull in the values from a couple of different fields and use that as the name instead. And actually, I am going to switch back to opportunities for this because of one of the arguments I want to use just to show you something. So I'm going to jump back. So in this case, instead of creating a new field, I want to edit my opportunity name field, and I'm going to make it a calculated field. And I'm going to look for that concatenate function, which is called concat. You can see it takes two or more pieces of text and puts them together. Really important to see in the example what they've done here is they have included a space as one of their arguments. If you don't put spaces between your arguments, it's going to just run them all together with no spacing. So that is something we'll want to think about as we build out our example here. And what I want to do is I want to have all my opportunities named using the name of the related account and then the expected close date for that opportunity. So I can just quickly see at a glance, you know, who's the opportunity with and when is it for. In order to use the account name, I'm going to use that related field function that Justin pointed out. So I want to pull in the name of the account and use that as part of my formula. You could technically type this all out yourself using the related function, but it's a lot easier to use the little wizard that they've built in to make that easier for you. All right, so I'm going to start with that. Then I'm going to put a space in, maybe a space and a dash. And the other thing I wanted to put in here was my expected close date, which is this date closed field. Now that is not a text value, but this field is appending text together. So if I just go ahead and use my date closed field, it's going to give me an error because I'm not using a string, a text value, for my second or my third argument here, my date closed. So I need to use that toString function to first convert the date into a text value, a string, and then I can use it in my concatenate function. Now I could put more things into that function. I don't have to just have two things there. If I want to put in the amount or any of the other fields from my opportunity screen, I could certainly pull those in there. All right, the next one we're going to do is at the account level. So we're going to use that rollup function that Justin had pointed out, and we'll do a couple of examples there. First, we're going to do a count of the number of opportunities that the account has, and then we'll do a sum of how many dollars the one opportunities have for that account. So let me jump over to the accounts module. We'll go ahead and add a new field. The first one is going to be a count, so that's going to be an integer result. Opportunity count. And we'll make that calculated. And so again, we could do this just building it ourselves, but they've added this little wizard in here to make it easier. We can say we want actually, it turns out they haven't for count. They've done it for the sum, the complicated one. So let's just really quickly insert one in here without worrying about the details, because I want to show you this piece. That's the piece that I always want to check the wizard for, which is how is that relationship named? Different formula types kind of refer to that slightly differently, and sometimes they're plural and sometimes they're singular, and I don't want to have to remember that. So even if I'm not doing a function that's in the wizard, I will start there and just get that example to look at of how it's named, and then I can come down here and I can find my count function, and I can see all I need to do is put in that link to see what it wants to count. So I need to count the opportunities, and I can go ahead and pull this example out now that I don't need it anymore for my function. So what this is going to do is it's going to look at how many opportunities each account has connected to it and just give me that number. Now that's going to count every single opportunity, whether it's won or lost or open. If I wanted to just count some of them, I'd have to do a conditional count, which the next example we're going to do is going to be a conditional sum instead of a conditional count, but the functions are there for both. So in order to show you both the sum functions and the conditional functions, I'm going to put that together into this function here, which is going to do a conditional sum. Again, if I was starting this without having just done this a minute ago, I would start with the rollup function. Even though conditional sum isn't an option here, I would say, give me an example to look at as a starting point. I know what I want to do is add up that likely field for the opportunities. So again, I can kind of see as a starting point what that looks like. Then I can go into my functions and I can see there's actually conditional versions of the count and the sum and the minimum date functions. So I can use that instead. I can see this is going to start off the same way with that link and then the field that I want to sum up. But then I'm going to have two additional things, which is to tell it which field to look at to see whether or not to include this particular opportunity in my sum, and then what values I want to have in a list of values for when it should include them in the sum. So again, we're going to start the same way. So we'll just copy that over and then get rid of my example. And I only want to include opportunities where they are won. So that's going to be the sales status field in my opportunities module. I missed a quote there, so we're going to put that quote in there. And then I need to give it a list of options. When I'm giving it a list, I have to tell it it's getting a list by telling it to create a list. Even if I'm only giving one value, it needs to be able to treat it as a list. And then I need to put in the value that I want to look for, which is closed one. If I had multiple values, like I wanted to include the lost values, I could include that as well in my list, but I don't want to do that. I just want this one. So again, what this is going to do is say, find all of the opportunities where the sales status is closed one, and then add up the amounts of all of those opportunities for each account. All right, I've got a couple more examples. Hang in there, I'm getting there. I did want to give you a wide variety of examples here. So the next thing I want to do is something that I use pretty often, which is if-else logic. So this is what you would use if you want different things to happen in different situations. Anytime you have sort of a, well, in some cases I want you to do this, but in other cases I want you to do that. That's where an if-else function would come into play. So what I'm going to do with my if-else function is, let's say I wanted to take my different case statuses. This is actually a real example that Justin had recently. And they wanted to take their case statuses and kind of generalize them into just an open versus closed value for whatever reason, show in the portal or to put in an email template or something like that. So in this case, I need to check to see what the actual status of my case is. And actually, let's go take a quick look at those status values. So if it's new or assigned or pending input, I want to call it open. And if it's closed or rejected or duplicate, I want to call it closed. So with the if-else function, the first thing I'm going to have is a true or false statement, a Boolean statement, where it's going to find out if that thing is true or not. So that's going to be like, what's my if condition? Then I'm going to have an argument for what to do if it's true and what to do if it's false. So if the first statement comes true, it'll do the first thing that follows that, the kind of the second argument, and if not, it will do the third thing. So in this case, I want to check a few different things. So I'm going to use the OR function. If any of the things inside my OR function are true, that counts as true. And so I want to check if the status is equal to new, or if it's equal to, what was it, assigned, or if it's equal to pending input. And if any of those three things are true, I want the answer to be open, and otherwise I want the answer to be closed. Now, this function is starting to look pretty complicated. It can be a little bit hard to kind of tell where the parentheses go together, where they don't. First of all, if it's helpful, you can put extra spaces in here. It's not going to mess up the formula builder. So sometimes, especially with if-else statements, I'll sort of split it out on multiple lines so I can see this is my if condition. This is what to do if it's true. This is what to do if it's false. The other thing that I'll do sometimes is just copy this over into an editor like Notepad++, which you can get for free if you don't have that on your computer already. And this will highlight the parentheses for me. So I can see where my different parentheses are opening and closing. And I can make sure that I've got everything where I want it to be. So I've got these three different equal statements kind of all embedded inside of my OR function correctly. And then my what to do if true and what to do if false. All right, I had a feeling I was going to get that error. I was thinking this was already, let's call this case status instead. All right, I've got one last complicated example and then one simpler example. And then I have to let Justin talk for a while. Sorry, Justin, I kind of took over. So the last example I want to do is to do a difference between two dates. In this case, I'm going to do the difference between when the case was created and when it was resolved. Now, this particular example is actually not necessary because Sugar has a standard field for this in Sugar Serve for calculating that, but it's a frequent enough ask that I wanted to show you how you can do it because it's a little bit of a funky way to do it. So Sugar has a function for doing the, let's see if I can remember what it's called. Oh, you just subtract actually. It doesn't have a function for doing like difference between 2 days. It doesn't have a subtract function for subtracting two numbers, but it doesn't have a, date difference or date subtract function. And so what you need to use instead is this days until function. And so what we're going to do is basically use the fact that we can figure out the difference between how many days it is until the date opened and how many days it is until the date closed, and compare those two numbers to figure out the difference between them. And I always have to stop and think about like which one's further, which one comes first. So in this case, we want to take the resolved date, how many days it's been since the case was resolved, and then compare that to the number of days it was opened. Did I do that right? It was open longer ago, so it's been more days since then, yes. Okay, so we're going to use the days until function and the subtract function. Let's start with subtracting. And we can do the days until the resolved date minus the days until the open date. That's one of those things that I'll stop and think about it, but also I'll just go try it. And if I get a negative number, then I know I did them in the wrong order. I come back and fix it. And we can go ahead and save that. Actually, before I save that, I do want to point out something. This resolved date time isn't filled in until the case is resolved. And so up until that point, this formula isn't going to work correctly because it doesn't have a date in this date field. It's an empty field. Now, it won't show the user any errors. The user won't notice anything's wrong, but it will log an error in the sugar log on the back end. And sometimes, you know, it can be a little frustrating to see those errors or you know, again, it is an error. You don't necessarily want errors. What you could do is put this inside of an if-else statement to check to see if this field is filled in. And so that would be sort of a better way to do that. I already did that, so if it will let me, it won't let me copy. Never mind. I was going to just copy and paste it over to save a few minutes, but we can do it. What we want to do is check if this field is filled in. The way that I normally do that, and Justin may have a better way, but I don't know it if there is to check to see if it has, is I use the string length function to see if there's a value there, if it's greater than 0. But this isn't a string, it's a date, so I have to convert it to a string. So I'm going to use 3 different functions here. I'm going to use toString and convert my resolved date into a string. Let me just type it, because otherwise it's going to put it at the end again. Come on. I'll type the whole thing. Then I'm going to put that inside of the string length function, strlen, to convert it to to get the string length of it. And then I'm going to put that inside of the greater than function to see if that result is greater than 0. And all of that is just a fancy, complicated way of checking to see if that field's filled in. And if it is, we want to use our formula, and if not, we want to just leave this field blank. That's another one that I would have copied and pasted over to Notepad before saving to make sure I had the parentheses in the right place. All right, and then one last super simple example, although it's not a good idea for the reasons Justin just talked about. If you want to copy a value from one field to another, or from one record to another, you can just drop in a field here. So first of all, I could just copy whatever field, something that's text, into a field, just copying it straightforward. Probably not something you'd use very often. But if I want to copy in a related field, I would just use that related field function to pull in the account field that I wanted and drop it in here. And as Justin mentioned, this is going to mean that every time the account gets updated, all of the related cases get updated. And oftentimes an account might have a lot of cases. So this is really not a great way to resolve that particular need, because you're going to end up causing issues with case or account saves. One last thing really quick. Sorry, Justin, I'm going to take one more minute. When you create calculated fields and you put them on your layout, see if I have 2 of them in there. Okay. These fields don't have any values in them yet. Even though they're calculations, the calculations are calculated when the record is saved. And so if I were to go to a case, right now those fields are going to be empty on every single case. So here we can go into this case, and I can see that neither of those fields have any value. If I edit and save the case, those fields should get filled in. And so really important to recognize that when you create new calculated fields, those calculations don't automatically get applied to your existing records. If you want them to apply to existing records, you need to edit and save them, which you can do either one by one like that, or you can do a recalculate values, which is a mass update just to edit those records and make those calculated fields edit.